This painting shows one of the most famous deaths in English literature, a moment Shakespeare never actually put on stage, and the real woman who modelled for it almost died for real making it. A decade later, she would die in a way that echoes this exact painting so closely. People still call it eerie today. This is Ophelia, painted by John Everett Millais between 1851 and 1852. It's now in Tate, Britain, in London. Millais was only 22 when he painted this, and already one of the founders of a small rebellious group of English painters, calling themselves the pre-raphaelite Brotherhood. They rejected the polished, idealized style taught at the Royal Academy and wanted to go back to something closer to painting, before Raphael obsessively detailed, painting directly from real life. Nature rendered with almost scientific precision. One of the other founding members of that same small brotherhood was a young painter and poet named Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the same man who, years later, would end up marrying the woman about to model for this exact painting. This particular painting shows Ophelia, a character from Shakespeare's Hamlet. In the play, Ophelia is a young noblewoman who loses the man she loves, then loses her father to violence at that same man's hand, and slowly loses her own mind in the process, before wandering off alone and drowning in a nearby stream. Here's the detail most people never realize. The drowning never happens on stage. Shakespeare only has another character describe Ophelia's death afterward, second-hand, in a single speech. Every image people now associate with this moment, the flowers, the floating hair, the open mouth still singing, was invented by Millais himself, painted 250 years after the play was written, and true to his Brotherhood's principles. He worked on this painting for about 5 months, and in an unusual choice, painted almost the entire landscape, first the riverbank, the willow, the flowers, before adding Ophelia herself at all. To find the right setting, Millais searched until he found a spot on the Hogsmill River, near the town of Ewell in Surrey, that matched Shakespeare's description almost exactly. Then he sat there, outdoors, up to 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 5 straight months. Part of that grueling pace wasn't just dedication, it was technical necessity. Millais painted using a method called wet white ground, laying his colours directly onto a base layer of white paint before it had any chance to dry, section by small section, to get that glowing, almost luminous colour the pre-Raphaelites were famous for. The technique made the colours extraordinary. It also meant that once an area was painted, correcting it was almost impossible. So every square inch of that riverbank had to be right the first time. And even setting the technique aside, the actual conditions were miserable. In one surviving letter, Millais complained, "The flies of Surrey are more muscular and have a still greater propensity for probing human flesh." He was nearly reported to a magistrate, accused of trespassing and damaging a farmer's hayfield just by working there. And by his own account, he was, more than once, in genuine danger of being blown by the wind directly into the same river he was supposed to be painting. The woman who posed as Ophelia was Elizabeth Siddal, only 19 years old at the time. Millais was just as obsessive about her costume as he was about the flowers. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "Today, I have purchased a really splendid lady's ancient dress, all flowered over in silver embroidery. It cost me, old and dirty as it is, £4. To get the pose right, he had Siddal lie fully dressed in that same antique gown, inside a bathtub full of water, in his London studio, for hours at a time, through the winter. He placed oil lamps underneath the tub to keep the water warm. On one of those sessions, the lamps went out. Millais, completely absorbed in his painting, didn't notice. Siddal never said a word or broke her pose. She came down with a severe cold afterward, possibly pneumonia. Her father was furious. He sent Millais a letter demanding £50 to cover her medical bills. Every flower floating around her is botanically accurate, and almost everyone was chosen on purpose. The willow, leaning over her head, stood for forsaken love. Nettles growing beside it meant pain. Daisies near the surface symbolized innocence. The violets around her neck represented faithfulness, and, specifically, death in the young. Pansies floating near her hand stood for thought and love given in vain, and the poppy resting right beside her fingers meant exactly what it usually means: sleep and death. Even the roses tangled into the bank were deliberate, a direct nod to a line from the play itself, where Ophelia's own brother calls her the Rose of May. Further out in the water, forget-me nots carry a meaning built right into their own name. Meadowsweet floating near the bank was chosen specifically to hint the futility of her death, beautiful and already too late to matter. Even the small fritillary flower, easy to miss entirely, was a recognized symbol of sorrow in the same visual language. Millais even included a flower Shakespeare's own text points to directly. In the original speech describing her death, Gertrude mentions Ophelia weaving in long purples, a real wildflower that, according to the same speech, shepherds called by a much cruder nickname, while proper young women of the time politely called them dead men's fingers instead. Even Shakespeare's own flower list, 400 years before this painting existed, was already smuggling in a joke. Half his audience wasn't supposed to admit they understood, because Millais painted outdoors across an entire spring and summer. The flowers gathered in this single moment don't actually bloom at the same time of year in real life. Here's the part almost nobody knows walking past this painting in a museum. Elizabeth Siddal didn't stay just a model. In the years after this painting, she became a serious painter and poet in her own right, and began an on-again, off-again engagement to fellow artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti that dragged on for roughly 10 years before he actually married her in 1860. The delay wasn't casual. By most accounts, Rossetti was repeatedly unfaithful and kept avoiding the wedding, until Siddal, worn down by the broken promises, left him at one point and swore she was finished with him for good. He only finally went through with the marriage after finding her critically ill, apparently close to death. Her health, always fragile after that, grew worse over the following years, made harder still by genuine dependence on laudanum, an opium tincture doctors of the era prescribed for almost everything. In 1861, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter and fell into a deep depression afterward. 10 years after modelling for this painting, in February of 1862, Elizabeth Siddal died. She was 32. The official cause was an overdose of laudanum, a medicine made directly from the opium poppy, the exact same flower Millais had painted resting beside her floating hand a decade earlier, as a symbol of death. Her husband's grief afterward became almost as strange as the painting itself. Rossetti buried his only manuscript copy of an unpublished book of poems inside her coffin, pressed directly against her cheek, as a final tribute, the only handwritten copy of years of his own work, gone forever into the ground with her. 7 years later, in 1869, he changed his mind. Struggling financially and increasingly desperate to publish, he arranged in secret to have her grave in Highgate Cemetery opened at night, and the poems retrieved from the coffin. The woman painted a decade earlier as literature's most famous drowned poet figure had her own real grave dug up in the dark, so a poet could get his words back. This painting's afterlife didn't stop with Siddal either. In 1994, psychologist Mary Pfeiffer published a book called Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls, drawing directly on Shakespeare's character, and by extension, on the image most people actually picture when they hear her name, which is this painting, not the play. Pfeiffer, working as a therapist for over a decade, argued that adolescent girls were struggling not primarily because of broken homes, but because of an entire media-saturated appearance. Obsessed culture actively working against their sense of self, losing themselves, the way Ophelia loses hers, just slower, and without a river. The book stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 straight years, turning a 400-year-old fictional drowning into shorthand millions of parents and therapists still use for a very real, very modern crisis. When it was first exhibited in 1852, the reaction was nowhere near the universal love this painting gets today. One critic at the Times mocked it outright, writing that there must be something strangely perverse in an imagination that would souse Ophelia in a weedy ditch, complaining the open mouth looked somewhat gaping and babyish, with no pathos, no melancholy in the whole scene. Another reviewer, less kindly still, said the painting reminded him of nothing more than a dairymaid in a frolic. Even the one publication willing to praise Millais at all could only manage a backhanded compliment admitting his talent, while suggesting he still needed to get rid of what it called the wild oats of his art. It still sold for 300 guineas. 4 decades later, in 1892, wealthy collector Sir Henry Tate bought it, and it became one of the founding treasures of the gallery that still bears his name today. And Millais himself didn't stay a rebel for long. The same young painter, mocked for painting a dairymaid, eventually became president of the Royal Academy and was made a baronet, the very institution his brotherhood had originally formed to challenge. This painting is now considered one of the most important works of the entire Victorian era, endlessly reproduced in film, fashion photography, and album covers, often by people who have no idea it's actually a scene from Hamlet, or that critics once laughed at it. The Brotherhood didn't survive that early backlash alone either. In 1851, the same year Millais was out in Surrey painting this riverbank, the influential critic John Ruskin published a public letter defending the pre-Raphaelites in the Times, after the paper had accused the group of monkish follies. His support helped save their reputation. At the time, Ruskin was married to a woman named Effie Gray. Within a few years that marriage was annulled, still unconsummated, and Effie Gray went on to marry the very painter Ruskin had once publicly defended, John Everett Millais himself. So the next time you see this image of a woman floating peacefully, surrounded by flowers, mid-song, remember everything actually built into it. A moment Shakespeare never put on stage, invented entirely by a painter who nearly got blown into a river trying to paint it faithfully, using a technique so unforgiving that a single mistake could ruin months of work. A real teenager who nearly caught pneumonia, helping him invent it, wearing a second-hand dress bought for £4, flowers chosen individually for what they meant, some innocent, some, according to Shakespeare's own text, quietly not arranged in a season that never actually existed in nature. And 10 years later, the same young woman, by then an artist in her own right, worn down by a 10-year engagement and a marriage that came only once she was already dying, succumbing in a way that echoed the exact symbol resting in the painted hand Millais gave her. Even the people around the edges of this story couldn't escape their own tangled versions of it. A critic who defended the painter, married to a woman who would leave him for that very same painter. More than a century later, an entire generation of readers would borrow this drowned woman's name again to describe a very different kind of losing yourself. Maybe that's the real mystery of this painting. Not how convincingly Millais imagined a death that never happened on any stage, but how many real people, in real centuries after him, kept finding themselves in it anyway. So do you think Elizabeth Siddal ever really escaped the role she posed for?